It was a cold October evening in the small mountain town of Silver Ridge, nestled deep in the rugged wilderness of Montana. The streets, illuminated by the soft glow of antique lampposts, were quiet, with only the faint hum of wind weaving through the evergreens. Life here moved at its own pace, slow and predictable, much like the waters of the creek that meandered through the heart of town. But that predictability would soon be shattered, leaving scars that would never truly heal. The Silver Ridge Police Station, a modest brick building with a single flagpole swaying gently in the breeze, was manned by a skeleton crew that night. Sheriff Dan Fuller, a burly man with a penchant for black coffee and old westerns, sat at his desk, sifting through paperwork. Officer Lucy Grant, fresh out of the academy and eager to prove herself, was at the front desk, typing up a report. The justification for this action was that she had a helmet and free seat. In the holding cell at the back, a young man named Eddie Mathis was sleeping off a night of poor decisions, his snores echoing faintly through the halls. What none of them knew was that something was stirring in the wilderness beyond the town's edge. Something massive. Something hungry. The grizzly bear that would later become infamous across the nation had been a resident of these forests for nearly a decade. A male in his prime, weighing close to 800 pounds, he was a creature of habit. He knew the rhythms of the land, when the salmon would run, where the sweetest berries grew, and which human encampments offered easy pickings. But this year, the wilderness had been cruel. Late spring frosts had stunted the berry crop, and a summer drought had dried up the streams. By autumn, the bear's instincts were screaming for him to prepare for hibernation, yet his body was not ready. Hunger had driven him closer to human habitation than ever before. Over the weeks leading up to the incident, there had been whispers in town of a bear prowling near homes, tipping over trash cans and raiding chicken coops. But sightings were sporadic, and the townsfolk, used to living alongside wildlife, didn't think much of it. After all, a bear's presence wasn't unusual here. They'd always given the animals space, and the animals, in turn, left them alone. When they didn't, this unspoken agreement had held for generations. Until now, the first sign that something was wrong came at 9:47 p.m. Lucy, seated at the front desk, heard a faint scraping sound outside the station's double doors. She frowned, tilting her head to listen more closely. A raccoon, perhaps? Or maybe the wind had kicked up debris. She shook it off and returned to her report. Then came the thud. It was heavy, deliberate, and close. Lucy's fingers froze over the keyboard. She glanced at the glass-paneled doors, her reflection staring back at her. For a moment, all was still. And then the doors burst open. The bear's entrance was as sudden as it was terrifying. The heavy doors slammed against the walls, the sound reverberating through the station like a gunshot. Lucy screamed, her chair toppling over as she scrambled backward. Sheriff Fuller, startled by the commotion, knocked over his coffee cup as he bolted to his feet. The bear stood in the doorway, its massive frame nearly filling the entrance, its dark eyes scanning the room with a mix of curiosity and desperation. The bear's fur was matted, its movements erratic. It wasn't acting like the elusive, cautious grizzlies the townsfolk were accustomed to. This bear was bold, unrelenting, and driven by a hunger that clouded its judgment. "Lucy, get back!" Dan barked, reaching for the rifle mounted on the wall. But the bear moved faster than any of them anticipated. With a guttural roar that shook the very air, it lunged into the room, swiping at desks and chairs with claws as long as a man's hand. Papers and equipment scattered like leaves in a storm. Lucy barely managed to dive behind the front counter as the bear's paw came crashing down where she'd been standing moments before. Sheriff Fuller leveled his rifle, his hands trembling as he aimed at the beast. But in the chaos, Eddie Mathis, awakened by the noise, began shouting from his cell, his panicked voice adding to the cacophony. The distraction proved costly. As Dan hesitated, the bear turned its attention to him. What followed was chaos, distilled into moments that felt both agonizingly slow and terrifyingly quick. Sheriff Fuller tried to stand his ground, but the bear's sheer size and ferocity overwhelmed the room. It swiped at him with a force that sent him sprawling, his rifle clattering to the floor. He shouted for Lucy to run, his voice raw with urgency. But Lucy was paralyzed, her mind a blur of fear and disbelief. She could hear the bear's ragged breathing, smell the musk of its fur, and feel the vibrations of its movements as it prowled through the wreckage. Eddie's shouting grew louder, his fists banging against the bars of his cell. "Hey, hey, over here!" he yelled, desperate to divert the bear's attention. For a brief moment, it worked. The bear's ears swiveled, and its head turned toward the back of the station. It began moving in Eddie's direction, its heavy footsteps echoing ominously. But the holding cell's reinforced door stood between the bear and its target. Frustrated, the bear reared up on its hind legs, towering over everything in the room. It let out a roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. Eddie shrank back, his bravado evaporating as the reality of the situation sank in. The bear swiped at the bars, its claws screeching against the metal, but the cell held firm. Lucy, still crouched behind the counter, seized the momentary distraction to reach for her radio. Her hands shook as she fumbled with the device, but she managed to call for backup. "This is Officer Grant. We need immediate assistance at the station. There's a bear inside. I repeat, a bear inside." Her voice cracked, but the urgency was unmistakable. Sheriff Fuller, dazed but determined, crawled toward his rifle. Blood trickled from a gash on his forehead, and every movement sent waves of pain through his body. But he knew they couldn't wait for help to arrive. The bear was relentless, its hunger driving it to extremes. If they didn't act, the situation would only worsen. The bear, growing increasingly agitated, turned its attention back to the main room. Its eyes locked onto Lucy, who had inadvertently drawn its gaze with the static of her radio. With a low growl, it began advancing toward her, its movements slow and deliberate. Lucy's heart pounded as she backed away, her mind racing for a plan. She grabbed a chair and hurled it toward the bear, hoping to startle it. The chair struck its side but only seemed to enrage it further. "Dan!" she screamed, her voice filled with desperation. Sheriff Fuller finally reached his rifle. Gritting his teeth, he took aim, his vision blurred by sweat and blood. He fired a warning shot into the ceiling, the loud crack momentarily halting the bear's advance. It roared in defiance, its ears flattening against its head. Dan knew he had only bought them seconds, but he intended to use them. "Lucy, get out now!" he bellowed. Lucy didn't need to be told twice. She scrambled toward the rear exit, her legs trembling beneath her. The bear, sensing her movement, lunged after her, but Dan fired another shot, this time aiming closer to the animal. The noise and the impact on the floor diverted its attention once more, giving Lucy the precious moments she needed to escape. Eddie, still trapped in his cell, watched the scene unfold with wide eyes. "Sheriff, don't do it! Just get out of here!" he shouted. But Dan wasn't listening. He stood his ground, rifle in hand, as the bear turned its full fury on him. What happened next was a blur of movement and sound. The bear charged, and Dan fired again, the shot echoing like thunder. The two collided in a chaotic clash of man and beast, the room a whirlwind of destruction. Furniture splintered, glass shattered, and the air was filled with roars and shouts. For those outside the station, the noises were a horrifying symphony of violence, each sound a reminder of the primal force they were up against. When reinforcements finally arrived, summoned by Lucy's frantic call, the station was unrecognizable. The bear, wounded and disoriented, had fled into the night, leaving a trail of destruction in its wake. The officers who entered the building were met with a scene of devastation: overturned desks, shattered windows, and the acrid smell of gunpowder lingering in the air. At the far end of the village, 3 men in black suits were making their way to the courtyard, leading a dog. Sheriff Fuller was found slumped against a wall, his rifle still clutched in his hands. He was battered and bruised but alive, his determination and quick thinking having saved lives. Lucy was outside, her face pale as she recounted the events to the arriving officers. Eddie, shaken but unharmed, remained in his cell, his earlier bravado replaced by a stunned silence. In the aftermath, the town of Silver Ridge was left reeling. The incident became a stark reminder of the unpredictable and often dangerous intersection between humans and the wild. The bear was eventually tracked down by wildlife officials, its emaciated condition a testament to the desperation that had driven it to such extremes. For the residents of Silver Ridge, the experience left a lasting mark, a chilling story passed down as both a warning and a testament to resilience. The events of that night underscored the importance of respecting nature and understanding its power. For those who call Bear Country home, the lessons were clear. Always be vigilant, never underestimate the wild, and remember that coexistence requires both caution and respect.